Okay, now we're on to step 3B of the Columbo. Again, remember there are 3 steps. Step 1, determine what the other person believes. What did you mean by that? Step 2, get the reason for belief. How did you come to that conclusion? Step 3, which we just reviewed, is use a question to show the view is self-defeating. There's some internal contradiction. Now, step 3B is take the point to its absurd conclusion. And I do want to reiterate that this is the kind of approach you want to take if it's not a logical discussion you're having around a topic, but it's more of an emotional topic. And you'll see what we mean. So we want to take the claim to the absurd conclusion. So you assume the other person's point of view for the sake of the argument, and then you press his point to its logical and absurd consequences. By logical and absurd means something he himself wouldn't accept. I do have to point out this disclaimer. The following examples are to point out the weaknesses in particular types of opinions. This material is not intended to offend or demean anyone, but to critique poorly thought out views. What I mean by that is people are going to assert claims that to them are very emotional, and that's fine. But the justification they have for their position has to have some logical basis. And what we're doing is we're looking at what they consider to be the basis for their position. So again, this is not intended to offend or demean anyone, but to critique poorly thought out views. So let's take the first one. A statement. Homosexuals are born that way. Well, let's take that sort of position to the end of it and its absurd consequences. If I were born with a natural impulse to beat up homosexuals, would that make gay bashing morally acceptable? Or if people who enjoy necrophilia are born that way, does that mean that necrophilia is acceptable? For those who don't know, necrophilia is having sex with dead people. And what we've done here is we've taken the position, if you're born with some preference, it means that preference is okay, and you should be allowed to pursue that preference. Well, my preference is beating up homosexuals. And if I'm born that way with that preference, then I should be allowed to do it. That doesn't follow. Obviously, the consequences are horrific. And for those who really want to be disgusted, if I'm born with an impulse or preference for necrophilia, and if being born with a preference justifies that behavior, then I should be allowed to do that. Here's one. People's behavior is okay as long as they aren't hurting anyone. Well, let's take that to its absurd conclusion. Should peeping toms and necrophilia be okay since they aren't hurting anyone? Peeping toms are just looking at people. It's an intense violation of privacy. It's very creepy and weird, but they aren't really hurting anybody, so why not let them do it? But what about necrophilia? The person's dead. They aren't feeling anything. Well, it's an absurd conclusion. There are no absolute morals. Well, if that's true, there are no absolute morals. Can I steal your stereo? Because your morals and my morals differ. I think it's okay to steal. I'm going to steal your stereo. Do you think that's okay? Let's try to make it real. Number 4, morals are an invention of a culture. Well, okay. So step back. Let's look at history. If morals are an invention of a culture, are there any cultures that did morally reprehensible things that could be justified with this behavior? Well, yes, there is. But you want to frame it as a question. When did you begin to think Hitler could murder the Jews in the Holocaust? The Nazis were a culture, a nation, and they thought they could murder Jews in the Holocaust. In fact, they thought it was good it was commendable to murder Jews. And that means they would be doing wrong to not murder Jews. So if that was the morality of their culture, why do we think it's wrong? We are governed by the natural process of evolution. Well, then can the strong oppress the weak? And if the person answers yes, then the person who answered yes had better be bigger than the person who who asked, then can the strong oppress the weak, right? Again, absurd conclusions. You shouldn't force your views on me. But why you're forcing your views on me about not forcing views on people? Again, you're intolerant and arrogant. Aren't you being intolerant by name-calling? So, aren't you being intolerant and arrogant by making that accusation? Here's one. God wouldn't have done it that way. Well, why can't an omnipotent and omniscient being choose to do things that are inefficient or his own way? Where does the Bible say that God can't do it that way? Religion is a crutch for weak people. Well, could atheism be a crutch to escape the gaze or judgment of God? And there are atheists who made that statement. It's that they don't want there to be a God, so they find evidence for there not to be a God. It works both ways. And there's also a question about why do weak people lead you to the conclusion that God doesn't exist? That doesn't follow. Even if there are weak people, God may still exist. Number 10. Two people who love each other should be allowed to marry. Well, you can see where this goes in terms of its absurd consequence taken to its end. Why not allow entire groups of people to marry each other if love is the only criteria? Or should I be able to marry my dog if love is the criteria? Should brothers and sisters be able to be married since they love each other? Number 11. People who are homosexual should be allowed to marry because they are born that way. It's again that born thing. Well, I'm not recommending you say this, but I just am putting this forward to show how illogical this may be, because the question could be, you could ask the question, doesn't that make homosexuality sound like a genetic disease that should be cured? If they're born that way, then is that a genetic disease? I mean, what does it mean they're born that way? People are born with all sorts of genetic defects. Now, again, I'm just intended to show that this is not a good position. You could also ask, if I'm born with a fetish for a horse, then should I be able to marry the horse? Again, taking these emotional comments to their logical conclusion.